Hello friends, today I am going to start the discussion of Aijaz Ahmed in theory, classes, nations, literatures. Actually, this theory book is a famous book written by Aijaz Ahmed, but I am in today's video going to focus on a particular chapter, Indian literature, notes towards the definition of a category. This is the chapter 7 of the book, and this essay, Indian literature notes towards the definition of a category, comprises almost 43 or 44 pages. But before going to the text itself, let me say a few things about Aijaz Ahmed, who was born in 1941 and he died unfortunately this month, 9th March 2022, a few days ago. Was an Indian-born Marxist philosopher, literary theorist, and political commentator. He was the Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine School of Humanities Department of Comparative Literature. Comparative literature was the subject he was teaching, and Ahmed actually died in California at the age of 81 on 9th March 2022. He was hospitalized for age-related ailments and had returned home only a few days prior to his death. And his death is a great loss for the field of literature, especially in the field of theory. Aijaz Ahmed was born in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, and his parents migrated to Pakistan following partition. In his book, In Theory, Classes, Nations, Literatures, Ahmed primarily discusses the role of theory and theorists in the movement against colonialism and imperialism. Actually, Ahmed's argument against those who uphold post-structuralism and postmodernist conceptions of material history revolves around the fact that very little has been accomplished since the advent of this brand of post-colonial inquiry. The book contains an especially polemical critique of Frederick Jameson's argument in quote-unquote third world literature in the era of multinational capitalism, where Ahmed attacks Jameson on the grounds that Jameson's argument is insufficiently theorized in its use of terms like third world, which appears to be confined purely in terms of its experience of colonialism. ফলে থার্ড ওয়ার্ল্ড বলে ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচারকে যে বানতে চাওয়ার একটা প্রচেষ্টা, তার এগেনস্টে অ্যাটাক করেছেন জেমসনের সেই থিওরিকে। অ্যাকচুয়ালি থার্ড ওয়ার্ল্ড থিওরি হ্যাজ বিন অ্যাটাকড বাই আইজাজ আহমেদ। This in turn leads Jameson to make hasty and untenable generalizations about how all third world literature would necessarily function as a national allegory that, according to Jameson, works as resistance to a system of global postmodernism. However, there are many chapters, literary theory and the third world literature, some contexts. This is the first chapter of this book, In Theory. Languages of class, ideologies of immigration, and Jameson's rhetoric of আদারনেস অ্যান্ড দ্য ন্যাশনাল অ্যালিগরি, এই সমস্ত এসেগুলো বিভিন্ন সময়ে তিনি যে লেকচার দিয়েছেন, এমনকি এডওয়ার্ড সাইদের অরিয়েন্টালিজম অ্যান্ড আফটার বলে তার একটা বিখ্যাত এসে রয়েছে। মার্কস অন ইন্ডিয়া, কারণ তিনি একদম মার্কসিস্ট যে থিওরিটিশিয়ান ছিলেন সেটা তিনি প্রকাশও করেছেন, ক্লারিফিকেশন দিয়েছেন সেটার ব্যাপারে। আর আমরা যে টেক্সটার উপরে ফোকাস করব, লাইন বাই লাইন পড়ব, সেটা হচ্ছে ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার নোটস টুয়ার্ডস দ্য ডেফিনেশন অফ এ ক্যাটাগরি এবং থ্রি ওয়ার্ল্ড থিওরি, এন্ড অফ এ ডিবেট, এইভাবে তিনি চ্যাপ্টারগুলোকে সাজিয়েছেন। এবং অ্যাকনোলেজমেন্টে তিনি যেটা উল্লেখ করেছেন, জেমসনস রেটরিক অফ আদারনেস অ্যান্ড দ্য ন্যাশনাল অ্যালিগরি, হুইচ অ্যাপিয়ার্স অ্যাজ চ্যাপ্টার 3 of this book, was originally published in Social Text in New York, fall 1987, and is reprinted here with only minor corrections. কিছু কারেকশন এখানে আছে। সালমান রুশদির সেম appeared under a different title as one of the occasional papers on history and society issued by the Center of Contemporary Studies, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. তো বিভিন্ন জায়গায় এই এসেগুলো তার পাবলিশ হয়েছিল এবং সেই এসেগুলোকে তিনি এখানে উল্লেখ করেছেন। এবং এই বইটার সম্পর্কে আমরা বিস্তারিতভাবে একটু পরে আলোকপাত করব। তবে তিনি ইন থিওরিতে ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার এবং তার কমপ্লেক্সিটিকে একটা তুলে ধরার চেষ্টা করেছেন এবং এটাকে থার্ড ওয়ার্ল্ড লিটারেচারের যে ক্যাটাগরিতে বাঁধার একটা অপচেষ্টা ওয়েস্টার্ন ক্রিটিকরা করে থাকেন, তার এগেনস্টে কিন্তু একটা নতুন অস্ত্র থিওরির ক্ষেত্রে। নাও ফ্রেন্ডস, লেটস স্টার্ট দ্য চ্যাপ্টার 7, ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার নোটস টুয়ার্ডস দ্য ডেফিনেশন অফ এ ক্যাটাগরি। বন্ধুরা, ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার নোটস টুয়ার্ডস দ্য ডেফিনেশন অফ এ ক্যাটাগরি তার অন্যান্য এসের মতোই, এবং এটি প্রথম পাবলিশড হয়েছিল ইন থিওরি ক্লাসেস নেশনস লিটারেচার 1992-তে। তবে তার অন্যান্য প্রবন্ধগুলো, যেমন করে জেমসন্স রেটরিক অফ আদারনেস অ্যান্ড ন্যাশনাল অ্যালিগরি, সালমান রুশদির সেম পোস্টমডার্ন মাইগ্রেন্সি অ্যান্ড রিপ্রেজেন্টেশনস অফ ওমেন, এবং এডওয়ার্ড সাইদের উপরে যে লেখা ওরিয়েন্টালিজম অ্যান্ড আফটার, এগুলো তার বিভিন্ন জার্নালে প্রকাশিত হয়। এবং আহমেদস ওন অ্যাডমিশন থেকে আমরা জানতে পেরেছি যে ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার, এই প্রবন্ধটি হ্যাজ ইটস বেসিস ইন সেমিনার প্রেজেন্টেশন হেল্ড অ্যাট দিল্লি ইউনিভার্সিটি অ্যান্ড জওহরলাল নেহরু ইউনিভার্সিটি ইন 1988। 1988 সালে তার বিভিন্ন যে সেমিনার অ্যাটেন্ড করতেন, সেই সেমিনারের একটা প্রেজেন্টেশন ছিল এই এসেটা। যাই হোক, আহমেদস this essay is concerned with several issues of importance pertaining to the unwieldy category of Indian literature. Ahmed discusses theoretical and institutional problems encountered while talking of a separate entity such as Indian literature. এবং এই এসেটা তার অন্যান্য এসের মতোই মার্কসিস্ট পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে লেখা, এবং এই এসেটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি যেটা প্রায় 40-এরও বেশি পৃষ্ঠা জুড়ে রয়েছে এবং যেখানে প্রায় 9টি সেকশন রয়েছে। দেয়ার আর 9 সেকশনস, 9 সেকশনস আর দেয়ার। তো এই এসেটায় অ্যাকচুয়ালি তিনি কতকগুলো সমস্যাকে তুলে ধরেছেন, এবং তিনি এখানে যে প্রধান যে সমস্যাটার কথা বলছেন সেটা হচ্ছে ডিফাইনিং ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার given its uneven historiography and the multilingual milieu of Indian culture, the mixed and sometimes fuzzy origins of various Indian literary genres, and the status of English as a language in India. এই ইস্যুগুলোকে তিনি এখানে তুলে ধরেছেন, এবং এই যে প্রশ্নগুলো এবং এর উত্তরগুলো দেওয়া অতটা সহজ নয়, এবং সরাসরি উত্তর তিনি দেনও নি এখানে। So, while the attempt of discussing such a various range of issues within the scope of a single essay does lead to some methodological inconsistencies, the achievement of the essay lies in its proposal of reading Indian literary productions in a multilingual framework with an increased emphasis on comparison and interdisciplinarity as methodological tools in order to create their historiography. ফলে এখানে অনেকগুলো ইস্যুকে অ্যাকচুয়ালি তিনি তুলেছেন এবং সেগুলোর প্রতি আমাদের একটা দৃষ্টিকোণ তুলে ধরেছেন। যাই হোক বন্ধুরা, আমরা টেক্সটটা একটু শুরু করা যাক। ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার নোটস টুয়ার্ডস দ্য ডেফিনেশন অফ এ ক্যাটাগরি। ওয়ান অফ দ্য ডিফিকাল্টিজ উইথ দ্য থিওরিটিক্যাল ক্যাটাগরি অফ থার্ড ওয়ার্ল্ড লিটারেচার, ইট শুড বি ক্লিয়ার এনাফ, ইজ ইটস রাদার ক্যাভেলিয়ার ওয়ে উইথ হিস্ট্রি। Its homogenization of a prolix and variegated archive which is little understood and then hurriedly categorized. Its equally homogenizing impulse to slot very diverse kinds of public aspirations under the unitary insignia of nationalism, and then to designate this nationalism as the determinate and epochal ideology for cultural productions in non-Western societies. ফলে নন ওয়েস্টার্ন সোসাইটিজে একটা ন্যাশনালিজম, ইউনিটারি ইনসিগনিয়া অফ ন্যাশনালিজম বলে বলা হয়, এবং তারপরে সেটাকেই ডেজিগনেট করা হয় যে ন্যাশনালিজম অ্যাজ দ্য ডিটারমিনেট অ্যান্ড ইপোক্যাল ইডিওলজি ফর কালচারাল প্রোডাকশন। এবং এটা কিন্তু ওয়েস্টার্ন সোসাইটিজের পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে। সো ইটস মোর রিসেন্ট propensity to inflate the choice of immigration into a rhetoric of exile, and then to contrive this inflation as the mediating term between the third world and the first. Koshambi once said, the outstanding characteristic of a backward bourgeoisie is the desire to profit without labor or grasp of technique is reflected in the superficial research so common in India. Ironically enough, so much of what is published in the metropolitan countries displays this very characteristic of the backward bourgeoisie when it comes to the third world. I find it all the more difficult to speak of a third world literature when I know that I cannot confidently speak as a theoretically coherent category as of Indian literature. So this is important where Ahmed is actually problematizes the very fact that the purpose of this chapter, what is the purpose of this chapter? The purpose of this chapter therefore is not to pose category by category an Indian literature, the national specificity against third world literature, but rather to explore some of the difficulties we currently have in constructing such a category. এই রকম ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচারের ক্যাটাগরি বলতে আমরা যে সমস্যাগুলো ফিল করছি সেটাই পোজ করা বলে তিনি তার এসের এই সেকেন্ড প্যারাতে পরিষ্কার করে উল্লেখ করেছেন হোয়াট ইজ দ্য পারপাস অফ দিস চ্যাপ্টার এবং তার আর্গুমেন্টসকেও তিনি পরিষ্কার করেছেন। ওয়ান অফ মাই আর্গুমেন্টস হিয়ার ইজ দ্যাট উই ক্যান নট পজিট আ থিওরিটিক্যাল ইউনিটি অর কোহিরেন্স অফ অ্যান ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার by assembling its history in terms of adjacent but discrete histories of India's major language literatures. A national literature in other words has to be more than the sum of its regional constituent parts if we are to speak of its unity theoretically. Given this position, I could not possibly be arguing at the same time that if we can assemble the historiographic knowledge of the discrete national literatures in these tricontinental zones, we shall somehow arrive at the third world literature. In other words, I emphasize not just the obvious lacuna in our empirical knowledge, but also that number one, developments during the colonial period are everywhere embedded as much in the pre-colonial legacies as in the colonial process as such, and B, cultural productions everywhere greatly exceed the boundaries set by the colonial state and its policies, so that the highly diverse historical trajectories may simply not be available for generalizing theoretical practices and unified narratives on the tricontinental scale. And according to Aijaz Ahmed, a literature exists as a theoretical object to the extent that its productions can be examined in relation to their objective determinations by the development of the culture as a whole, so that periodization comes to rest on shifts more fundamental than mere breaks in chronology and is able to account for the dominance of the major generic forms, their uneven developments in terms of the period and region, as well as the material conditions of the subordination of other generic forms in the course of historical development. The possibility of that kind of objective determination in the process of the material development of a culture can certainly exist across languages and state boundaries. Culture and literature, according to Aijaz Ahmed, culture and literature, in other words, are not necessarily coterminous with linguistic formation and state boundary, especially in historical epochs preceding the emergence of the bourgeois nation state, and in countries like India, even after the emergence of such a state. The rise of print capitalism is a variable but by no means an invariable determinant. The difficulty in thinking of an Indian literature therefore is not that it is spread over many languages with histories of very uneven development, nor that the state boundaries which have historically contained these literary productions have been shifting through all the centuries we know of. The difficulty lies rather in the very premises that have often governed the narrativization of that history, which number one, which has privileged high textuality of the Brahminical kind of posit the unification of the literary history. Number 2, assembled the history of the main texts of particular languages in very uneven way. To obtain this unity through the aggressive principle. Or number 3, attempted to reconstruct the cross-fertilization of genres and themes in several languages, but with highly idealistic emphasis and with the canonizing procedures of the great books variety, with scant attempt to locate literary history within other sorts of histories in any consistent fashion. I shall discuss these ways of narrativizing Indian লিটারারি হিস্ট্রি অ্যাট সাম লেন্থ বিলো। তিনি বিস্তারিতভাবে পরে আলোচনা করেছেন। থিওরিটিক্যালি অ্যাডভান্সড ওয়ার্কস অফ হিস্ট্রিজ অফ পলিটিক্যাল অ্যান্ড ইকোনমিক স্ট্রাকচার্স has shown that it is possible to speak of an Indian history which is not the history of mere rules and empires and religions, is not composed of discrete developments of in sectors and geographical regions. This work, most notably of the Marxist historians, has laid the basis for future work of the empirical kind and created the possibility of theoretical abstractions and generalizations. Hence, for the plotting of periodization as regards the main form of production and property, as well as their regional and temporal variants, gaps in knowledge and disagreements among the historians themselves notwithstanding. It is in comparison with these other kinds of histories that the relative underdevelopment of the research genre of literary history in India stands in sharpest relief, especially as regards its theoretical premises. One of the consequences of these very uneven developments is undoubtedly that it is in these other kind of histories rather than the straightforward literary histories that one comes across some of the most profound insights about what we could generally designate as literary, especially for the earliest centuries. My own attempt here, in any case, is not to chalk out a full theoretical position. He clears to us. The essay is not to chalk out a full theoretical position, which for me would be at the very least premature, not to examine in detail the existing approaches, but simply to demarcate some areas which I find especially troublesome. So the very problems and troublesome aspects have been delineated by Aijaz Ahmed. Friends, the very purpose of this essay is very clearly shared by Ahmed himself. The purpose of this essay is to delineate the ways in which Ahmed problematizes the category of Indian literature. It also tries to critically analyze formal features of this essay, primarily in terms of its organization of content and arguments. Offering an insight into the strategies of argumentation used by Ahmed, this essay tries to explore its merits and contribution to Indian literary criticism. It would also try to highlight some of the methodological problems primarily related to Ahmed's language and divisions of the chapter. Furthermore, this essay will try to analyze whether Ahmed's hypothesis actually leads to a conclusion consistent with it, or is it beset with ideological contradictions. Finally, it attempts to locate Ahmed's essay within a certain brand of Indian literary scholarship that has dealt with the questions of Indian literature, arguing that there is a certain inconsistency, especially in Ahmed's essay, when it tries to address the question of unity in diversity. The basic premise of the chapter is that the category of Indian literature cannot be spoken in unitary terms. Therefore, it is an exploratory foray to chart out methods through which the complex layers characteristic of Indian literature can be understood. Ahmed draws attention to the central problematic of the essay right at the beginning, hypothesizing that I find it all the more difficult to speak of a third world literature when I know that I cannot confidently speak as a theoretically coherent category of an Indian literature. His prime agenda in the essay is to lay bare, by the means of various examples from the Indian literary history, the inefficacy of any form of syndicated approach towards Indian literature. Through this essay, there is resistance expressed against convenient piling up of individual histories of different Indian languages in favor of a more nuanced narrativization which takes into account the differences and commonalities along various Indian literary cultures. Let us start with the first part. At some level, of course, every book written by an Indian inside the country or abroad is part of a thing called Indian literature. It must be. But the institutions that could produce a coherent and unified knowledge of the various language literature clusters in India, either in a strictly comparatist framework or as a unified, albeit multilingual object of knowledge, have had a rather sporadic development, so that despite superb work by individual scholars, there are very few institutional sites where such knowledges may be systematized and disseminated among large number of students and teachers. As a result, the intelligentsia that could reproduce these knowledges on an extended scale remains quite dispersed and in some key areas largely undeveloped, leading to several kinds of difficulty. হ্যাঁ, এটা তো নিশ্চিতভাবে থাকে। It depends on the institutional intelligentsia, universities, সেখানে কিছু করার থাকে না, সেই জন্য সেই সমস্ত এরিয়াগুলো undeveloped থেকে যায়। There are major languages and literature for which no comprehensive history is really available. The tradition of circulating texts through the various linguistic communities of India by means of mutual translations without the mediation of English is so weakly developed that even where such historical research does exist, it is rarely accessible to readers outside the particular linguistic community because of the lack of translations. The tradition of any sustained effort to study the literatures of the various languages in mutual relation as overlapping realities constituting a unified configuration is ever weaker, so that we have as a rule a peculiar disjunction between an assertion that there is an Indian literature and the actual production of a knowledge which refers essentially to discrete archives of individual languages with principles of aggregation either absent or very weakly developed. So this replicates in some ways those other conceptual frameworks which produce the category of European literature both as civilization unity and as a comparatism of discrete national literatures. Like most analogies, this one has its uses, but one of the distortions which result from confusing an analogy with a model is that the modern languages of India are then seen as discrete and markedly differentiated entities, as if the relationship between, say, Hindi and Urdu, or between modern Hindi and the half a dozen languages which have historically composed it and continue to have extremely diverse relations with Hindi itself as well as with each other, aware of the same orders as say that between English and French, Italian and Spanish. These confusions and inadequacies of reliable information as to texts, authors, genres, modes of transmission, audiences, and so on are most marked with respect to those early periods when what we know now as our modern languages emerges out of complex and prolonged process of mutual influences and differentiations. And of course, these processes have been regionally very uneven. Tamil in the south undoubtedly had a much more autonomous development and became a court language very early alongside Sanskrit in the north, so that the earliest extant texts can be dated more or less precisely in the 1st century BC or thereabouts, even though much has been destroyed by the passage of time and unreliable modes of transmission leaving large lacuna. For Kannada, the earliest inscription is from the 5th century AD, though large bodies of writing came only much later. We have only scant studies available in other Indian languages of the process whereby languages of the south got their differentiated identities, of the role of Sanskrit in the succeeding centuries in affecting the linguistic literary as distinct from the religious ambience of these languages. 8% of the vocabulary in Malayalam is said to be of Sanskrit origin. But what is the literary significance of this linguistic property or of bodies of literature, notably Sangam literature in Tamil, which remains much less studied in both literary and historiographic aspects than the contemporaneous Sanskrit literature? The transition from Sangam to Bhakti, which was also a Tamil phenomenon, is known only in very broad outline, but not really as a transition, more as a discrete epochal shift after a gap of centuries and the intercession of an epic tradition. Nor is it clear how this phenomenon of Tamil origin spread through the Deccan plate and then across the Binda Parvat, eventually to all corners of the land, if indeed the northern forms of Bhakti were in some fundamental way a continuation of the southern, which is again not entirely established except through discrete pieces of evidence in the work of individual poets. So apart from the recognition of various heterodox traditions that constitute Indian literary cultures, Ahmed also points to the urgent need for systematic recuperation of various literary forms and traditions. Modern Indian languages have solidified absorbing various overlaps and influences that are characteristic of languages such as Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, and Malayalam. Ahmed cautions against accepting all that is canonized as Indian literature in the following words: the gaps in knowledge. He says, the gaps in knowledge as well as the great fluidity and unquantifiability of what is known should be chastening for anyone who sets out to theorize about Indian literature. So he implicates Orientalists like Schlegel, Winterwinds, as well as nationalists such as Aurobindo Ghosh in the project of privileging classical Sanskrit texts known for their spiritual and religious overtones. He says, even plain historiography is at a very preliminary stage, given the large gaps in existing bodies of documentation, show that even a descriptive kind of knowledge about Indian literature adds to its unities, its essential periodizations, the relationship between various sets of writings which are available from the same period, the circulation of principal genres through the overlapping linguistic clusters, and about scores of other such issues is still a very uncertain nature. Yet, histories of individual languages as discrete entities also tend to be misleading. Since multilinguality and polyglot fluidity seem to have been chief characteristics, possibly the characteristics which give Indian literature its high degree of unification in the pre-modern phase. So, what is this? Indian literature, its high degree of unification in the pre-modern age was given by this chief characteristic, the multilinguality and polyglot fluidity. Unilinguality seems to have been the aspiration only of certain kinds of canonical scholasticism, whereas mass literary cultures and even many of the elite formations remained polyglot well into the 19th century, when the insertion of print capitalism, modern forms of unilingual vernacular education, the rise of literary predominance of professional petty bourgeois strata, and the rise of many regional and religious particularisms speeded up the process of linguistic differentiation and the attendant claims, objectively fabricated and subjectively felt claims, the unilinguality. For the earlier period, Mohan Singh Divana states the matter eloquently. There were hardly any poets from Gorakh of the 10th century to Ghulam Farid in the early half of the 19th century, belonging to Maharashtra, Gujarat, Bengal, Agra, Oudh, Bihar, Delhi, Punjab, and Sindh, who had not written in three languages: the mother tongue, the provincial language, and the common Hindustani language, Hindui, besides Persian or Sanskrit, such as he could command. Among Mughal kings, one might have mentioned Akbar, who is said to have composed in Braj language some verses in the Bhakti mold, which are now irretrievably lost. And for Bengal, one could name Vidyapati himself, who is claimed by Hindu and Maithili as well as Bengali. The list, in other words, could be virtually infinite. এই তালিকা দীর্ঘ. Even the linguistic categories are so fluid that the three languages from Miran are named by Umashankar Joshi alternatively as Rajasthani, Braj, and Gujarati, the line between Hindui and Braj undoubtedly being very thin. And I have pointed out elsewhere, even Divan's own insistence on broad and opulent heterogeneity, which is itself entirely well placed, is unfortunately too contaminated with the restrictive triadic category: the mother tongue, the provisional language, and the common Hindustani language, which was invented in more or less fantastic manner in the course of the 19th century through a shifting but always unholy alliance between indigenous linguistic fundamentalists and colonial demographers, to be recovered in post-colonial policy in the liberal three languages formula. On none of the cases where Divana himself notes the languages in which individual poets wrote does this fixed tripartite division have any bearing. Linguistic fluidities have been historically of a very different kind. It is a negotiating those fluidities so naturally embedded in the versions of the poems we now have, so bewildering for the untrained modern reader, that the initial linguistic aspect of comparative work begins. This question of overlapping multilingualities. This is another concept, another problem that he is saying, Ahmed is focusing on. That English is the carrier of modernity and technology, which, however, is responsible for the creation of a class of intelligentsia actively engaged in the translation of literary texts from English language to the Indian languages and vice versa. Given the fact that most of the translation projects involve English and at least one Indian language rather than translation between other Indian languages, English becomes the language in which Indianness gets articulated. Such translations tend to get canonized, leading one to believe in a highly selective range of Indian literature, one that significantly leaves out the relatively untranslatable, that is, the oral and performative cultures of India. So this overlapping multilingualities remains as well for the more modern archives, as they have been assembled since the introduction of print and the classificatory practice of the 19th century. I know from experience, for example, he says, that the whole range of publishing in Urdu gives us no sense of literary developments in Kashmiri or Punjabi or modern Hindi or Telugu, even though the Urdu language has always existed in regions and states where these other languages are also spoken and written, often by the majority of people. All the Urdu academies, all the departments of Urdu in colleges and universities have failed to sponsor any real project of comparative scholarship, research and translation aimed at a fuller understanding of the composite linguistic and cultural milieu in which they operate. I believe this emphasis on exclusivity is by no means unique to Urdu institutions, even though the situation is different in different linguistic communities. Translations from other Indian languages are more common in Telugu and Bengali, mainly through initiatives from the literary intelligentsias themselves, as well as Hindi, owing both to state sponsorship and to individual initiatives. But this is not work that receives much emphasis in most languages. Lacking such public institutions for overlapping translations, direct language of an Indian literature presumes the knowledge of so many languages that only rare specialists could command them all, and considering that public rewards for such labors are minimal, competencies of that kind presume rare kinds of linguistic abilities combined with very exceptional kinds of individual industry and devotion. Indeed, most of the work of this integrated field has been done by individuals who managed this rare combination. And then he says, my third example of the kind of comparatism we need in order to establish both the heterogeneity and the fundamental unity of Indian literature refers to genres and forms of composition. We know that the Podo, for example, becomes a translinguistic pod, often very flexible genre for the Bhakti poets, as did the Doha. We also know that the Doha, like the বারোমাসের কাহিনী যাতে বর্ণিত থাকে, which was also a favorite translinguistic form for these polyglot poets, survived well into the contemporary period in less and less religious forms, becoming more and more secular. Doha more in oral traditions, Baramasa in lengthier and therefore in slightly more formal ways, both oral and written. That are the what are the histories of the genesis of these respective forms, their properties, their usage, their alterations over time and across language, literature clusters. Which social grids and belief system produce them? Which ones account for their mutation, decline, replacement? What happens to the Baramasha, for example, as it evolves in Hindui, develops in one direction into what was increasingly differentiated into Hindi and Urdu, lived in Urdu in close proximity with the other generic form, Mathnavi, as it was initially imbibed from the Farsi, but as it draws closer, first metrically and then in systems of beliefs and imagery to genres like Baramasha. How does one locate then Dayashankar Nasim's famous and in Urdu the first major Mathnavi entitled Guljar-e-Ishq, means Garden of Love, in this system of generic and more than generic overlaps? One could ask similar questions about the more modern period in terms of both thematic and generic shifts. What happens, for example, to Indian narrative traditions in the 19th century when the idea of companionate marriage is introduced as a necessary form of household in bourgeois society across regions and languages into the imaginative universe and the narrative structures of the newly emergent modern third estate? We need to assemble these genealogies of genres as well as their sociology, not for any formalistic reasons, but because of the genres often serves as the very horizon which defines the general semantic field, the presumptions of belief systems, the politics of transgression and containment, and the very possibilities of what are called the aesthetic effects of the individual utterances as well as of the authors and waivers. For instance, if the name of Kabir can simply because of a collective signature for certain kinds of utterances, partly erasing the distinction between the poet and the Punthi, that is because in certain kinds of beliefs communities, certain kinds of belief communities, the sharing of specific generic features of some existing utterances generates the possibility of more such utterances so profuse that only the act of compilation and transmission sets the limits of their reproduction. By the same token, the possibility of generating more and more such utterances disappears or becomes transmuted only when the belief community which gave the genre its stability disappears or shifts to markedly different systems of beliefs and utterance. That is why merely enumerating the compositional forms, classifying their aesthetic effects and properties, and slotting various available works under the various generic designations, which is what our literary history generally does when it addresses the question of genre at all, while it may often be of much empirical value, remains from the standpoint of history itself merely tautological. So friends, in this essay, Aijaz Ahmed actually to a large extent challenges the homogenizing approach towards Indian literature, best exemplified in Sahitya Academy's slogan proposed by Radhakrishnan, Indian literature is one, though written in many languages. The essay successfully debunks this notion and convinces us that for Indian literature to be a valid category, it must be treated not in singular but in plural terms, for it is the plurality and polyphony of Indian literary cultures that give it its character. Slowly but surely, there is a greater interest in Indian literary traditions, evident from the increased number of dissertations and researches devoted to topics related to the field of Indian English writing, translation, folk cultures, comparative Indian literatures, and so on. There is now an increased inclusion of Indian literature in its various forms, be it Indian writing in English, Indian literature in English translation, as well as Indian literary criticism. Not many would deny that it would be much more sensible to speak of Indian literatures rather than Indian literature. আমরা এই সমস্ত খুঁটিনাটি জিনিস নিয়ে আলোচনা করব যে কোন কোন ভাবে আমরা আইডিয়া অফ ইন্ডিয়াননেস পাচ্ছি, because it talks about treating Indian literature in a vocabulary which does justice to its challenges. Ahmed radically hypothesizes that the idea of Indian literature must be analyzed in all its complexity with a primary focus on the gamut of Indian languages, the works of which must be translated into each other, facilitated by proficient and multilingual scholars in Indian institutes. কারণ তিনি আগেই এটা উল্লেখ করেছেন, পাবলিক ইনস্টিটিউশনে এই ওভারল্যাপিং ট্রান্সলেশনের প্রবলেম যেটা রয়েছে, সেই জন্য বিভিন্ন ভাষায় যে একই রকমের যে লিটারেরি প্রোডাকশান সেটাকে আমাদের জাজ করতে কিন্তু অসুবিধা থেকেই গেছে। এটা হচ্ছে ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচারের এই ভাষা আর বিভিন্নতার জন্যই কিন্তু এই সমস্যাটা। যাই হোক বন্ধুরা, আমরা সেকেন্ড পার্ট এবং সেকেন্ড সেকশন আলোচনা করব বা পরবর্তী সেকশনগুলো আলোচনা করব। এর জন্য পরের ভিডিওগুলো দেখতে থাকুন। থ্যাংক ইউ ফর ওয়াচিং দিস।